So this comic is our vision of what higher education would look like. I think we're facing very fundamental challenges and opportunities for change in higher education. My summer reading includes the Gutenberg parenthesis by Jeff Jarvis. And the proposal is that we are entering the beginning of a new age, and we're leaving behind 500 years of reliance on the written word. And we're going back to becoming effectively an oral culture, which I think is challenging for us as lawyers and us as academics. So I sort of recommend that. And what it highlights is really the extent to which we're going to have to rethink how we communicate, how we discuss, how we prove. And that's a challenge that we're going to have to face. So one of the big discussions, Lucia and I have become generative AI fans, I think, really, as potential teaching tools. But there's this idea that if you rely too much on generative AI, you fail to develop your critical legal thinking skills. And that's something that we as a community are going to have to decide what we think about that and what we do about it. MIT recently did some research, and the Telegraph brilliantly came up with with the headline, which everybody who doesn't use generative AI would like to think to be true: using AI makes you stupid. But if you look at the research, they gave 3 groups of students a task. One were allowed to use generative AI, one were allowed to use Google, and one were just working on their own devices, their internal resources. And the ones who worked on their own had better recall and understanding of what they'd written. I mean, I think that's not really very surprising. But what it points out to us is we have to think about how we make the students critically review the output of generative AI, where they use that for their learning or even for their assessment. And that's going to be the challenge that we all have to face. The original MIT research article is linked. And then there is, I think, a more nuanced reflection on AI and critical thinking skills in the LinkedIn post that we've included there. There will be a QR code at the end, and you can download our slides, and then you can access all of the links. I've started using Copilot to help students, to encourage students to use Copilot to read cases. Copilot is available to all of our students, so there's no concern about digital exclusion. But we know that not all students will have equal access to Wi-Fi devices, subscriptions, but at least we know that everyone on campus can access Copilot. And I think it's quite interesting to our students, particularly first-year students, to encourage them to ask for summaries of articles and cases and to interrogate those summaries. It seems to me that makes those texts accessible. We're dealing with a generation of students who haven't grown up reading. I read a book, a week from the age of 8, but I think it's very difficult now, intimidating. And so the question is, are we dumbing down? Are we spoon feeding? Or can we use these tools constructively to enable? And I think that we're going to have to we should build a pedagogy around that.
Another example of a helpful AI tool is NotebookLM. It's often used for research, but another quite helpful use case is to use it for policy documents. So we have a lot of policies at the university. They often get updated. So we've added links to NotebookLM, and then you can ask questions. For example, the RECIT policy has changed since last year, and colleagues are often asking questions about, are RECITs capped, as an example. The great thing about this NotebookLM is that it doesn't just give you an answer, it will give you the link directly to that document with that section in the policy, so we know that the information it's giving you is correct.
So this is my favorite AI-generated picture. This is a medieval university, and all of the books are flying out the window. We noticed suspicious submissions within a couple of months of the launch of ChatGPT 3.5. And so we spent the summer following, educating ourselves about what these tools could and couldn't do when it came to answering your coursework for you. But I like this image partly because I think we still teach in the manner of the medieval university. I was taught by people who in the 80s who were taught by people at Oxford in the 50s and 60s, and it goes very quickly all the way back to medieval Paris. There's a professor who speaks, there's a lecturer who reads, there's one copy of the book, and it's all built around the transmission of knowledge which is captured in places that are difficult to access. And now the books have flown out of the window, and I think it's time for us to rethink our pedagogy. So we know that students are using generative AI. The latest GIST survey, I think, put it as over 90% acknowledging the use of generative AI, over 80% for their assessment. So students are using generative AI. There are issues of digital exclusion. We know from our own experiments, amongst other, that generative AI can produce work that passes our assessments. And we know that the power of AI will continue to improve. I think that's almost certain.
We also know that these Gen AI tools can be detected. For example, we have the Turnitin, but we also know that it can be avoided. So we have so many different tools. Students can put it through one to generate it, put it through another to disguise the use of AI. So we can't really rely on these tools because they can be biased.
When we courseworks, we were getting answers that we would grade at narrow fail, narrow pass. But we put them into the latest tool that's available on ChatGPT+. This is the subscription version. It takes 5 or 10 minutes to grind its way through all of the websites it wants to visit. But I think it produces first-class work. So that's an absolute wake-up call for all of us. Because we're in a very difficult position if students can pass without doing any learning, doing any work. You know, the credibility of our awards, the integrity of our awards, I think is fundamentally challenged by the power of the tools that are now available. We're not pessimistic, but you can't ignore the challenge. So I think we can, although there were, Brian, I can't see where Brian is, but Brian will, there he is. Although there were some very panicky moments very early on, no one now thinks that you can really ban the use of generative AI. You can't police that ban. In many ways, it may not be desirable. It's certainly impossible. So everyone is agreeing that we need to rethink our assessment strategies. We asked ChatGPT what to do, and the advice was universities must assess judgment, not just information. I think we're moving towards not what do you know, because it's now easier to access that, but how do you know what you know is correct? What can you do with it? So we're looking at experiential learning, authentic assessment tasks. I think in a way that takes us in the direction of a more engaging and thought-provoking pedagogy. But I think we have to rethink our assessments, and therefore we're going to have to rethink our pedagogy, and we're going to have to rethink the outcome of our courses. And that's the challenge that this conference is addressing. We made very simple changes early on. I don't know what it's like at your institution, but ours is inevitably bureaucratic and slow when it comes to changing regulations. There's an awful lot of consultation and drafting that needs to be done. So I think we need to figure out what we want within the next 18 months so that when we hit our next round of validations, we can create the courses that we want. Because otherwise, if you are teaching the same course now in 5 years, 8 years' time, I think you're going to be really, really out of date. So we took away parts of the coursework that simply said, what is the impact of technology on the legal profession? That was a press a button answer. And we merged it with a reflective section that said, how will it affect you and what are you going to do about it? So we tried to make it a more personal, authentic task. And we took the marks that we saved by merging those two sections and put more marks into presentation, into the quality of the report. And we are now paying much more attention to the referencing. Not just as a formality, have you formatted the reference correctly, but have you checked the output? Do you know that this that this reference exists, for example. And we know recently that there were some lawyers who were submitting made-up cases to the High Court and got their fingers burned very badly.
So here are some ideas how we could revise our assessments. We know it's a massive piece of work to redesign an assessment. For example, our institution is now moving away from exams. So to change an exam, which we know is quite secure because students are there in front of you, they cannot use any tools, to now move into a different type of assessment is going to be a lot of work to make sure that it's designed well. So some good practices that already exist: authentic assessments, group projects with peer review, problem-based learning, self-assessment, and so on. And on the right, we have some suggestions from ChatGPT. So there are alternatives, but it takes time and a lot of effort to try to change this.
And just a heads up, I use ChatGPT for creating simulation tasks and assessment tasks. Can do quite a lot of heavy lifting. Like everybody, you want to check it afterwards, but we've got tools available to us to help us meet the challenges that those tools have created.
So there are a lot of opportunities, but there are also a lot of concerns. Some of them, ethics. We need to make sure that we promote transparent and responsible use of these AI tools, both students and staff. We need to prevent over-reliance. We have to make sure that students and staff are still using their critical thinking and their professional competence. Data privacy is really important. We have a legal obligation towards our students and staff to protect their data. So whenever possible, we should be using AI tools that have been approved by the university. As an example, the LSBU Copilot, and all our students and staff have access to those. If they use their login details, we know that the data is protected. If staff are using third-party tools, for example, ChatGPT, we instruct them to turn off the data sharing. So there is a setting where you can turn off for the data to be used for the training model. That's an instruction that is that we provide to staff and students. Fairness and equality. We need to address bias in AI tools. We know that what AI produces is based on the data that it's trained on, and often the data is biased itself. So we have to make sure that when we passing on these outputs, it's critically evaluated and we avoid passing on any bias with it. We also have to ensure equal access to these AI tools. That's why we're now rolling out all the training to staff and students and mitigate any risk of digital exclusion. We know that students who can afford it, often they have the paid versions of ChatGPT, for example, and that may disadvantage other students.
When we talk to students, we're unsurprisingly encountering individual students who've got concerns about being complicit in the climate impact of these tools. And they're very costly in terms of carbon footprint to develop. In terms of use, they're somewhere between a Google search and making a cup of tea. I think that we have to address these concerns perhaps through information and through possibly a carbon offset plan. But I think these tools are going to be so much part of a world of work that I wouldn't want to see them not used in our teaching. But that's for each institution, each team to decide for themselves. Clearly, there are issues around intellectual property. What we're trying to do is to engage with students through the pedagogy, through the assessment strategy, and make it part of their university education that they become literate in all of the issues that relate to this technology. And it's worth saying that another thing that we've heard from students is quite high levels of anxiety about mixed messages being received from one member of staff to another. And so you need the university to go beyond guidance towards policy, and policy is not a quick process. We're just sort of at the stage now of getting GovLegal to sign off on what might become a South Bank policy. So it's good to engage with your institution. I mean, maybe they're dealing with this wonderfully already, but if they're not, it might be a good idea to push upwards so that we get to a point where all staff and all students know what they can and can't do, know what the risks and benefits are, and are trained and have access to the appropriate tools.
I just mentioned one example is clarifying the ownership of the content that is AI generated. And as lecturers, we need to also role model this behavior. So for example, in slides, if they're generated using AI or with the help of them, we should acknowledge it to our students as well, because we are asking our students to do the same when they work on their coursework. So modeling that behavior to show them what is the right thing to do.
Yeah, and we hear stories, you know, of probably teachers who ban the use of AI in assessment, but then use it to write their slides, and the students, you know, comment on them. So we developed a policy for our students on our module, and we discussed this with them, and we had a session in class before the first coursework. But we basically said, we will teach you how to use this. But you must acknowledge your use of AI. We got involved in that debate about whether you should footnote AI. And given that it's not an authority, we think you don't footnote it, but if you've used it, you should acknowledge it. And that you're still subject to the rules that require your assessed work to be your own work. And the fact that generative AI might be a scraping and an amalgam of lots of people's work doesn't mean that it's your work. So you've got to put it into your own words.
The second page shows what students should be aware of, and there are some examples of how students can use it. In addition to this, our library already offers some courses specific to Gen AI on how students can use it for the revision preparing papers, for example. So this is the originality and use of AI statements that we ask students to complete.
And the aim of that partly is to reassure the students that if they've engaged with this, honestly, there's no danger of an unexpected, unintended breach of academic regulations.
But it very much depends on the student's honesty. So students may still say they haven't used it even though they have. So it's just one tool in the box. It's not the answer.
So these are some of the tools that we may use more and more. Adaptive learning. The best example I know is Barbari's online platform for SQE. It's an online learning course. You can decide whether you want to study over 10, 20 or 40 weeks. You get data analytics that tells you and prompts you whether you are up to speed or ahead of your goals. It will tell you whether you are behind or ahead of the average for your cohort. If you are not beginning to get enough right answers on your test questions, your test exams, it might switch the diet of questions that you're given to move away from aiming for the best possible mark in the exam to learning enough to pass. So if you're aware of Barbary, that's an example of a quite well-developed adaptive learning platform. I think this is coming our way. These kind of tools are coming our way. Not everything has to be bought off the, expensively. We might be building our own tools, but I think we're going to be using these kind of tools.
So one example of a custom-made tool that we use is Custom GPT. So this is based on a ChatGPT. You need a $20 per month subscription to create a custom one. So this is something a lecturer would have to have access to. And they can configure it so that it provides students with customized feedback on their coursework based on the coursework brief. And we can show you a quick demo how it works. So first, we'd introduce this in class so that students are aware how to use it. And then we also published link to the ChatGPT on VLE, on the Moodle virtual learning environment. Once they click on it, they would access a page like this, and all they have to do is drop their coursework draft into it. And once it's uploaded, you hit the button and it will provide you with feedback on your coursework that the students can use to then improve it. The reason why we created this is we normally allow time for students in lecture, like at the end of the lecture, within the last half an hour, we ask students come down to us and we can give you verbal feedback on your coursework. And what we found often is that students were making the same mistakes that were already kind of specified in the coursework specification in terms of what they were supposed to do. So this saves us time repeating the same thing over and over again. So this was the kind of the baseline basic feedback. And the time that we saved, we can then use for higher level discussions. What this looks like in the backend for the lecturer when they're creating it, it's very simple. You give it a name, description. This one has brief instructions, just to say, provide student with feedback, make it constructive, ethical, encourage critical thinking. And also we're instructing GPT not to write or rewrite or paraphrase any part of the student work.
And you can fine tune this. If you discover it's not working exactly as you want, you develop the instructions at this point.
And the only other thing is the knowledge bank. And this is where we upload the coursework specification that has the instruction, has the marking criteria and so on. So the very basics, this is what it has in the backend. Of course, you can elaborate on it and you can add more detail. We've asked our students what they thought about it, and 68% of our students found it helpful or very helpful. There are some qualitative comments down there, and they were asking if they can have tools like this for other modules because they found them helpful. We also did a quick check on the student performance between the year where they had access to the custom GPT and the previous year when they didn't. And the average mark have gone up slightly. The number of passes, number of fails went down from 7 to 1, and the number of first class went up from 10 to 15. We don't know whether the correlation is correct, whether it is because of this tool, but there may be an indication that it helped improve. Okay. Want to ask a question? Andy?
What?
Whether we can ask questions?
Okay, well, we're trespassing on other people's time, so very quickly. Just the final one. I've seen some attempts to manage misconduct that are very bureaucratic, and I don't think we have time. I think in the end, the real answer is to design tasks where you're measuring what students can do with the knowledge, not measuring how they got the knowledge.
When you say upload where? Onto the VLE or into the ChatGPT? To where?
Once they get feedback, they do it again. So if you want to see the progress,
I see. At this point, it's only the final version, but it's something that you can implement and develop within your coursework. So you can ask them, submit not just your final work, but also the feedback that you got and how you addressed it in your coursework. So there is a way to incorporate it directly. Absolutely.
So we tried to take that one step further into getting it to do our marking for us so that we can go down the pub or the theatre, wherever we want to go. But more seriously, you can't give up the marking process. Can't trust these tools, and there's a relationship of trust with the students and with the public. But to have something that's marking alongside you is interesting. And in my lifetime as an academic, I started off, we double marked everything. Then we moved to moderation, and now we're moderating 10%. So to have something that will pick up outliers is useful. We haven't got it right yet. Sometimes when you try and use these tools, you realize that your coursework marking criteria and instructions aren't quite as clear and unambiguous as you thought they were. It produces very good feedback, and it saved time in the marking process by us looking at the generic constructive feedback and adding or taking away one or two comments. So it did improve the moderation, and it did speed up the feedback writing process and therefore the marking process. But it helps to ensure consistency where you have 4 or 5 markers working on a large cohort. We haven't got it quite right yet, and we've still got to deal with that. And we're looking at our marking criteria, how we write them, to try and get the tool to behave more effectively.
An exciting thing we launched just yesterday, for now only internally within LSBU, is a guide with practical examples for staff how they can use AI within their teaching. It includes, for now, 12 examples that gives them instructions on how to implement this in their class. For example, one of them is improve coursework brief. Slide 3. They would have detailed document that would tell them step by step how they can follow through to use that tool. So that example is they would first pretend to be a student. They would upload the coursework brief and ask the tool to generate an answer. So first to test it, how good is the coursework brief against AI? And second, they would work with AI then to discuss how they can improve it to make it less acceptable for AI to complete it easily. So that's just one example. Another example is the custom GPT that we just demonstrated, and there are 12 of these. You will have access to these slides. For now, what you wouldn't have access to if you're external is to view more information. We're working on making this public in the coming weeks or months. Feel free to use it. If you have any examples that you would like to share that are not included that work really well for you, please get in touch.
We're trying to develop a community of practice, and we're very interested in the power of custom GPTs to create sort of focused tutor in your pocket tools so that students can ask the basic questions, get the basic advice, get feedback at any time that's suitable to them rather than forming a queue when you are available. And this is an alternative strategy, bottom up, to the university buying, some mega AI education platform. So that is quite exciting. We have the law and technology module, and we like real clients. So if anybody's got an ed tech application that they would like to explore, please get in touch with us and we'll make you a client of one of our student groups or a couple of them in the autumn term. It involves you coming online to 4 meetings in the term. So if there's an idea you'd like to explore and you'd like some help in realizing that vision, then please contact us and volunteer to be a client at the Technology and the Future of Higher Education website. We write a blog. You'll find it there. Andy's a robot, and I'm not sure about Lucia. We've got some more posts planned. It's about our experiments and adventures.
That's the link to the presentation.
All right. There's not really much time.